YouTube, Dawson Ryder here. For today's video, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the rumors for the Power Rangers reboot on one topic specifically. So, Jinsaku came out with some rumored details about it, that we were going to actually have Green as the lead focus, and that it was going to be kind of like a Tommy Oliver tribute, possibly even named after Tommy Oliver, as well as having a female Red Ranger, which was always the rumor, or at least the rumor for a good long time. And he also recently tweeted out some stuff, if I recall, or X'd out some stuff, whatever, about like their personalities, that Green was going to kind of be like a jerk that had to learn to be better, kind of reminded me of Connor a little bit, and that Red might have an arc about becoming leader. And it got me wanting to talk about this topic. I touched on it a little bit when I discussed the rumors in a video, and whether this ends up being true or not, who knows. But I thought there was some interesting ideas surrounding it. I mean, I know that the idea of doing effectively a Tommy Oliver reboot character and centering it around that and the Green Ranger leads to a lot of apprehension for people because of how much focus has been put on the Tommy character in the franchise overall up until this point, and then you have a chance to start fresh and you're kind of going backpedaling. Not to mention the fact that it's kind of weird that, you know, there was rumors that JDF really wanted to be more involved with the franchise with Hasbro and do its Green Ranger movie, and they didn't seem to want anything to do with that and wanted to start fresh with their reboot, and then lo and behold, after his passing, they're recentering things on possibly a Tommy-esque focus. So there's a lot of mixed feelings that come about as a result of it, not to mention some people are worried, whether they're in favor of it or not, that it'll bring about, you know, inevitable Tommy comparisons of like, oh, no one's going to beat JDF. So, but I did want to set that aside for a second in terms of like all the drama or the apprehension about the Tommy Oliver character specifically, and just kind of hone in on more of the idea of a Green Ranger leader. Because as we know, you know, for 98% of the time, Red Ranger is always the leader. He's like the most popular on the packages and all that type of stuff. On some rare occasions, we have gotten other leaders, you know, in both Sentai and Rangers. Of course, Tommy was the leader as the White Ranger for season 2 and 3. We've had, like, Delphine was leader as the White Ranger. In Zenkaiser, we had the White Ranger leader that also highlighted other White Ranger leaders in Sentai, such as Ninja White and Kaku Ranger and stuff like that. So I'm trying to think of any other different Ranger color leaders besides red and white, but it's not like it's unheard of for other characters to have the leadership role. But even when you have that, you always have that iconic imagery of the Red Ranger standing in the center. Like often, even in Kaku Ranger, you know, or Alien Rangers imagery or shots of the show, it's Red still like in the center. Same thing with like mmpr, like of course White was the leader, but then you had, you know, in the Thunder Megazord, Red's front and center. So you always just think of that as like the center in terms of like when you're picturing any given Ranger team, for the most part, outside of stuff like, you know, what's the big one from Jaka and Zenkaiser. For the most part, 99% of the time, when you think of Power Rangers, any team, you're thinking of Red Ranger right there in the center. So the idea of having Green Ranger there in the center is actually kind of interesting. Not just from an aesthetic standpoint, I mean it is, but it could be some really interesting storytelling. I know it sounds weird to say just based on the color, but I think it'd be kind of cool to have a fresh start and having this new sort of status quo with the Green Ranger in the middle. And, you know, as of this moment, we know very little about the reboot, and in a lot of ways, it seems like we're on shaky ground, so who knows, it could run one season, it could never run. But it would make me curious, like, how would they handle it in the long run? Like, presuming that eventually they would get maybe new suits and casts at some point, because even if this does well, I can't imagine they'll be able to hold on to the status quo they set up for like 10 years. Would we always now have Green Rangers as leaders in the Hasbro era, or I think it would be cool to experiment with the idea of having a different color be leader every time. You know, I don't know. I think that's just kind of a cool idea. Again, it would bring up a different aesthetic that would make the Hasbro era stand out, and I think could bring up something unique. Now, those like supposed leaks about their character descriptions also hints towards the idea that we could maybe see Red eventually become leader. Like maybe you start out with Green as the leader, and then Red, the female Red Ranger, eventually takes over as leader, which brings about comparisons to other things I thought about, kind of like the way they handled Voltron with Keith and stuff like that, as well as sort of more recently Rise of the TMNT that made Raph leader, which I actually found to be a very apt comparison in terms of like Leo sort of representing Jason, and then you have Raph representing Tommy, the little bit more of a rogue character to one degree or another that's kind of the fan favorite in a lot of ways. I actually thought that was super interesting. They wound up, in both of those cases, when they shook the status quo up, like with TMNT, they eventually changed it back to what it was, which I always had very mixed feelings about, because I thought it was kind of cool to see like a different origin, of how that went down, of like, oh, this is how they became leader. It didn't start out that way. And it made for some interesting character stuff. But at the same time, I hated that they had to go back to the status quo. I'm like, can't you just let this iteration be unique? Especially with Voltron, I'm like, I liked that there was different pilots and stuff like that. And I liked that Raph was leader. It's like, that was a cool change. So it brought to mind that comparison. Like, maybe they will have Tommy start off as leader and then eventually have Red, which could admittedly be an interesting story, but I don't know if I hope it goes that way, because again, as much as that can be interesting, I think that takes away from the purpose of shaking up the status quo for this iteration. It's not as if you're changing time, and when you do this, all of a sudden, Sentai and Power Ranger history has changed forever, and the Green Rangers have always been leader. It's just like, for this one iteration, but I think it could be kind of interesting. I mean, at the end of the day, in a lot of ways, it's kind of superficial, because you could have Green Ranger as leader just effectively playing the same role as Red Ranger, and it's literally just a color. It doesn't even matter. It's just, but I did think it was something worth thinking about on how it could go down. Again, I think that I would want it to happen, even if whether it was Tommy focused or not. In a lot of ways, I don't mind them naming the character after Tommy, but in a lot of ways, I think it would just be simpler if they just had the main character be, or the main character leader be Green Ranger, as like a subtle tribute, without getting into the trouble of Tommy comparisons, and also getting into, like, I don't know, the ick of, like, it seems like they're taking advantage of JDF's death for, like, oh, we're paying tribute to him, so, like, let's do headlines, like, when the reboot comes out, like, all the headlines, we want all the headlines that we're paying tribute by having Tommy Oliver be the main character. But I do hope that ends up being true in terms of the Green Ranger leader, because I like the idea of Hasbro starting off with kind of a unique look for their team lineup. And, depending on this, whether or not Red Ranger ends up eventually becoming leader or not, I think that might lead to some interesting stuff to talk about, and it's definitely something that's got me thinking a little bit as we've headed into this, how that's going to go. It definitely was also a surprise, because it felt like they really wanted female Red to happen, and it seemed like that was part of the reason they went that direction with Amelia, to sort of test the waters. So this also would make sense to me if any version of this is true, because it's kind of like having the best of both worlds, Hannah Montana style, where you got like Tommy Oliver, main character Green Ranger, but then you have female Red. And somebody did point out in the comments of my last video, a couple people I think, that just because he's the main character doesn't also necessarily mean that he could be the leader. Like, we could have the Green Ranger be kind of like the main character, central to a lot of the stories, but you could still have Red as leader. That also wouldn't be unheard of, as we've had PR seasons that have focused on other characters. Like, I probably will get arguments in the comments of why this isn't the case, but in a lot of ways, Dylan kind of presented as the main character in RPM, and he was the Black Ranger. So that also is a distinct possibility they could go for, is you have like Red Ranger's leader, so you get your female Red and all that stuff they want to do, but then you can have Green Ranger as like the main character in terms of like the story and the focus. Would honestly be kind of cool to do an inverse, maybe even, where you start off Red Ranger leader, Green Ranger as the main character, and he becomes leader by the end. I don't know. But what do you guys think? What are your thoughts on that? Do you want to see a Green Ranger leader, or in the center, like in the role of the Red Ranger, or do you want to just things to stay the same? I know a great deal of the fandom just wants to live in one little box, and that's the way it's supposed to be, but I'm at least interested by the potential of some new stuff. But let me know in the comments as always. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell so you get notifications for my videos. It's Awesome Writer, signing out.